My name is Katie Bell, and I am the blog editor for the Dickens Society, as well as the communications chair. And I'm also a high school teacher. So, the purpose of this video today is to help both high school teachers, secondary school teachers as well, and university teachers to tackle teaching Oliver Twist. It is a great book for younger readers, but it can often be hard for them to engage with it. And I tried it last year with my senior class. It was the first time I'd ever tried it. I had a lot of successes, but also a lot of struggles. And so the purpose of this video is to give you my successes and also share some resources that I developed to help other people teach this great book to their students. It's a book about a child and about children, teenagers as well, and a lot of the themes in it are easily applicable to today. So if you can get your students past a few of the problems, it's a book that I think they really will enjoy with your help. The four problems that my students had were, firstly, they struggled to connect with the dialect. They missed a lot of the humor. When we were reading out loud together, I would find myself laughing out loud, and I would be the only person in the whole classroom laughing. It's not a good feeling. And it was just because they couldn't understand the language. Secondly, this is British literature that I teach. Most of my students go on to university, but some of the students in my class are in that class because they need a senior literature credit and they weren't able to get a different kind of class to fill that. So their reading level might not be the same as my other students. And they had a lot of difficulty, those students, as well as my English as a second language students, they had a lot of difficulty following the conversation. Thirdly, most of my students struggled to figure out where Oliver was. You know, this is a parish boy's progress, and they could not track the progress. Fourthly, my students struggled to decipher how all the social networks overlapped. It was really hard for them to see how this is basically a soap opera and that all the groups had a finger in the other groups and knew somebody. So those are the four problems that I'm going to tackle today to help you be successful teaching Oliver Twist. Before we got started, two pre-reading assignments that I gave, and these were very helpful with gauging interest level and also gauging where my students were what I call 1 minute 19th century and then some pre-reading texts from the British Library website. So 1 minute 19th century, I can't claim that I developed that myself. It actually was called 1 minute Middle Ages when I pinched it from another teacher, but I made it 1 minute 19th century to pertain to this time period. So I developed on my own, I did do that, 30 different vocabulary words with which I knew my students weren't familiar. And I recommend having them search their term on the Victorian web. A lot of my students are not great researchers through no fault of their own. They just haven't been taught how to do it. And so I tried to give them a couple different websites to use as opposed to just using Google. So I would suggest doing that as well. And each student was assigned one term that would come back later in the book or more largely pertain to the early 19th century in which the book takes place, or London as well. And what they would do would they would research their term. They would have to present it verbally. There'd be no images, no screen sharing, nothing. Just verbally talk to the rest of the class for 1 minute or under about what their term was. And the other students, whilst they were listening, would take very brief notes about what the other 29 terms were. So ultimately, everybody left with 30 different vocabulary words that pertained to the text. And this encouraged my students to take a bit of a deeper dive into people, places, and things that they may never have heard of before, such as the New Poor Law, even simple terms like gruel. They didn't know what that was. And so I knew that they would lose the whole meaning of the scene when Oliver asks for more if they didn't understand what gruel was. So particularly Dickens's interest in exposing the Yorkshire schools and what went on in those is a really good early dive into the text. As well, his time in the blacking factory, Warren's blacking factory, is of interest too, and his childhood as well, walking around London, can be super helpful for them to understand his interest in people. And I will link the texts that I found helpful from the British Library website down below as well. These are really well written, valid resourced pieces that are image heavy, and my students were able to read them in one class period, digest them, answer a few questions. We had a very brief discussion about the topics. What I ended up doing was I had a couple different articles, and I grouped A group, B group, and C group to read article A, B, and C. And then I had what's called sometimes a Harkness discussion, a graded discussion on their understanding of the piece before we got started with the book. So the first problem, the language. Not a problem for me, probably not a problem for you, but in this era, unless they are just really interested in watching Acorn on Amazon or somehow get BBC America, they're not going to really have an understanding of that accent or dialect. And that might change depending upon where you're teaching. But in the United States, as much that you can give them that's well, for them to hear, it is super helpful. So Roman Polanski's film, hands down, I think one of the best ones, because all the actors, instead of verbalizing the comedy, they actually physically acted in that film. So, for example, Mr. Gamfield is played by Andy Linden of the East Enders. So he's constantly using his face and body because that's how a soap opera has to be played. Ian McNeice, amazing physical comedy, is Mr. Limkins of the Board of the Workhouse. And then, of course, Ben Kingsley, Fagin.
Fancy that.
Probably one of my favorite Fagins ever. He's really empathetic and plays the character in such a nuanced way that the students really could connect. And I found them, after we read Read, we'd watch a scene with Ben Kingsley, and then they would say, "Oh, I know this line." That's a great feeling. And a fun task I did as well before we got to the chapter about Streaky Bacon was I had just up on my interactive board a picture of Streaky Bacon, and I asked my students what did they think it meant, and I got a lot of answers from "you're hungry, miss" to "what don't you like about bacon" to "ew, bacon's nasty." And so then it helped us spark this conversation about the mix of comedy and tragedy in this book. And we also were able then to place that on top of other things that we're interested in. What would films interest them? What storylines interest them? They usually always have a mix of comedy and tragedy. And the one makes the other all the more better. Adding in as many visuals to teaching Oliver Twist really does help spark the conversation. Speaking of which, the conversation. The other problem. I didn't really understand or relate to this problem because I am a reader, as you probably are yourself. But a lot of our students today really don't read texts, longer texts. They just read short pieces and watch videos on YouTube, TikTok. And so their ability to read deeply and for long periods of time has really not been developed. And that's through no fault of their own. But they really didn't understand Oliver's dialect. They didn't understand that his, perfect English was a give that he is the essence of purity. And they balked at him. They didn't understand him until the Noah Claypole scene, and until the Noah Claypole fight. That's when they really were behind Oliver. And a great teacher that I had once told me that as readers, it is our job to find ways to connect with books that we read, to find ourselves in the character. And once the students could find themselves in some way in Oliver, that's when they were invested. So I would encourage you to pick out a couple of scenes for your students to engage with close reading. And close reading can be easily modeled. And it's something that a lot of teachers in literature seem to shy away from, but it's something that really anybody from any level of background can do with a little bit of practice. So a couple of scenes that would be good for close reading to help them to connect with Oliver would be, of course, the Noah Claypole fight. Who hasn't been in a fight that they didn't want to be in? And, maybe they won, maybe they didn't. Oliver's homelessness. Not everybody has been homeless, of course, but we can certainly understand the feeling of lack. Oliver's going along with the peer pressure in Fagin's den, and not necessarily understanding what he was doing was wrong until he saw it. I think that was a big gasp for a lot of my students. Oliver's kidnapping with Nancy and Bill, and Oliver's relationship with Nancy and with Bill as a sort of like trifecta was also really interesting to my students. They enjoyed kind of dissecting that. And interestingly, a lot of the dialect in Oliver Twist is still around today. And when we got started with the book, I gave my students an extra credit assignment to watch a London-based show, a couple of episodes of a London-based show, nothing too deep divey, and report back some tidbits that they found of slang or even just way of life, eating, things that they found to eat, ways that they got around the city as we read. So a couple of ideas would be, of course, Luther, an amazing television show and really well written. The revamped, of course, Doctor Who with David Tennant and Rose. I think Rose is a great character for, Christopher Eccleston, actually, sorry, and Rose as a way to understand that kind of person, I think is a really great help for a lot of my students. The next problem was keeping track of Oliver. For me, this issue was really hard to understand. They couldn't keep track of who was talking despite the punctuation cues and said Oliver after lines. That was hard for me to understand, but again, it's important for you to sort of disassociate how you read from how your students read. They struggled from that problem to understand when Oliver left places and moved to new people, when characters vanished and then new ones reappeared. So my solution for this was to bring the problem to a special education teacher with whom I work at Dunwoody High School, and she helped me develop this wonderful graphic organizer, which I dubbed Oliver's Progress. And of course, yeah, Pilgrim's Progress is going to be lost, Parish Boy's Progress, but that's okay. You know, they can get that later in life and look back on it and be like, oh wow, that teacher was really funny, and use this alongside reading Oliver. So this is meant to be an interactive graphic organizer that they use the entire time they're reading Oliver Twist. And it has different boxes, almost kind of like Candyland, where you track Oliver starting with his birth at the workhouse and going through all of his progress into London and with Fagin and the Brownlows and the Mayleys. And there's enough space in each box that your students can also write different characters that come into that section. And this document will also be linked in the video down below for you to use as you see fit if you like it. The next problem that my students had was unraveling the social networks. And this is where you as a teacher really need to break down things that you're reading alongside your class. And my fix for this was to make what is commonly referred to as an evidence board, but which I refer to as Oliver Twist Crazy Board. And this was so that my students could make connections between Bumble, Oliver's mother, Noah Claypole, Fagin, monks, everybody, and really draw the lines and understand how this book works as a television show, you know, not unlike soap operas of the 20th century. I mean, one of my favorite soap operas is Dark Shadows, and what can be so difficult for people to understand sometimes is that each episode is working concurrently. So, you know, in this episode, we might be focused on Mr. Bumble and his new wife and how unhappy they are. But concurrently, Oliver is living elsewhere and things are going on with him. And it's almost like that freezes and something else happens. So this crazy board kind of helps to track lines of connection between different groups of people. And this ended up being a really fun project for my students to do alongside me. They got up, wanted to help put stuff up there, wanted to help draw lines. And it's important to realize that the level that you're teaching, depending upon the level, not all students will understand the comedy behind these connections. For example, that it's so ridiculous that Noah Claypole joined Fagin's den because he really is green. He has no idea how to be a thief beyond just super petty, and ends up being completely overwhelmed by it, of course. And by giving them these sort of hard facts that they can be like, okay, this person connects up with this person, and I can see that. That helps a lot of learners who are still progressing with drawing dots between chapters of books. The last thing that I would recommend to do teaching Oliver Twist is really have an open discussion with your students about the prejudices of the time. I believe it's very important for students to understand the then contemporary prejudices against Jewish people during Dickens's time. And it really helps for students to see Fagin more clearly, to see how he's written, and also to make the connection between Fagin's Jewish humor, that sort of self-deprecating humor that some of my favorite comedians still use today, Jerry Seinfeld, Jonathan Katz, Billy Crystal, Milton Berle, although your students probably won't know who that is. It would really help as well, especially if your students are American, to explain the history of the Jewish people in at least just England, that they were expelled during the time of Edward I and then were readmitted with Cromwell, so that students can make connections. And this is a long-standing prejudice that didn't just occur in the 19th century, but was building up for several centuries. And what I have my students do to get started with that is I had them first read one of our blog posts on the Dickens Society blog by children's author Nancy Chernin, and I will link this down below as well. And she wrote a really eloquent piece about her wanting to write the children's book Dear Mr. Dickens, and how she felt trying to approach that topic, but also what she uncovered about Dickens's interactions with Jewish people, and how he actually questioned his own understanding of a people and their culture, and backtracked and said, oh, I think I had it wrong. And it really helped a lot of my students connect, because something that's contemporaneous to them, of course, is cancel culture and, celebrities on Twitter and Instagram, saying something and then not really having thought about it. And then, of course, their public calls them on it. So I think it's really relevant to consider these questions your students might have about starting conversations about how important it is for celebrities to evaluate their own views and how they engage with the public. It also helps to fully understand Fagin and why he is repeatedly referred to as the Jew, the Jew, the Jew, and then stops being referred to as that because Dickens had a bit of a change in how he wanted to approach his own prejudices. And the blog, I think, is a really helpful way. It's really well written for beginning learners as well. So some summative ideas to leave you on, because you always, as a teacher, want to see what did they learn and what can I do better next time. I would advocate for essay writing. That's because I think writing is important and a kind of lost skill on a lot of high school students. But of course, this will depend on your students' writing level and where they are. So that being said, don't turn away from short plot synopsis quizzes, because those can be really helpful. A lot of teachers are like, that's too easy. I don't want to do a multiple choice, who killed who and who is where. But giving your students some reassurances that, hey, I actually do know what's going on in this book, and I do know what happened in that chapter, and I understand the relationships that are going on. Those kinds of things can be really helpful and reassuring for your students and help them to build more confidence in getting ready to approach writing an essay about a book that they read. I would definitely recommend the summative essay that I did last year, which most were very successful with, which was to have your students choose an adaptation of Oliver Twist. Some of my suggestions were A Boy Called Twist, Oliver and Company, and then, of course, the musical Oliver. Not my favorite, but I'm not a musical person. A lot of my students liked it, so fair enough. And discuss how that adaptation helped them to better understand a character from the novel. For example, a lot of my students chose A Boy Called Twist. I think it's available on Amazon, so that's probably why they chose it. And they said that they felt that Nancy in the book was actually more relatable, more likable, and more interesting than Nancy in A Boy Called Twist. And I was shocked because I thought surely a modern adaptation would be so much more relatable. But they just felt that she came off as cold. They didn't understand why she even cared about Oliver. And I think what it ended up doing is making them reflect more deeply on Nancy and Oliver's relationship in the book, which they might not have given as much attention to without having watched the adaptation. And my point for you there would be try to think on the bigger picture of understanding relationships, understanding themes, as opposed to let me have them do this essay of intense literary criticism, because that's just ultimately not going to prove successful and you're going to have to grade it. So um, having your students show you what they understand about the importance of the book, why they feel that it's an important book, and why they feel that the literature and the humanities at large is an important subject, is really the purpose of teaching Oliver Twist. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope that you come back for future episodes where we'll delve into other topics and other Dickensian books. Thank you so much.